Bitter Creek runs. Delilah Boone had spent her whole life fighting to keep her ranch, but when her father's gambling debt came due, she had no choice but to turn to Beau Landry, a man known for collecting what he was owed. He smirked, tipping his hat. "Your daddy owed me plenty, sugar," he murmured. "But I reckon you might be worth more than the land." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Father's Folly. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a dust-caked writer whose eyes held the weary resignation of a man who'd seen too much of life's cruelties. Delilah Boone, standing on the porch of the only home she'd ever known, felt a chill creep up her spine despite the blistering midday sun. The Boone Ranch, nestled in the heart of Texas Hill Country, had always been her sanctuary, a vast expanse of rolling hills and stubborn, sun-baked earth that mirrored her own spirit. But the letter, bearing the crisp, official seal of the land office in Austin, threatened to shatter that world. She recognized the writer, a young man named Jed, who worked for the circuit judge. He'd always been polite, tipping his hat and offering a shy smile whenever he passed through their land. Today, however, his smile was absent, replaced by a grin set to his jaw. He handed her the letter with a mumbled apology, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. Delilah's fingers, callous from years of working the land alongside her father, trembled slightly as she unfolded the heavy paper. The words swam before her eyes, blurring into a menacing jumble of legal jargon and stark pronouncements. Foreclosure. Default. Auction. The words, sharp and cold, pierced the armor she'd built around her heart over years of hardship and loss. Her father, bless his reckless soul, had been a gambler. Not the kind who frequented smoky saloons, but the kind who gambled with the land, with their future, with every sunrise that promised a new beginning. He'd always believed in the next big win, the next boom, the next deal that would make them richer than Croesus. He died chasing that dream, leaving Delilah with a legacy of debt and a ranch teetering on the precipice of ruin. She'd buried him 3 months ago, beneath the sprawling oak that marked the family plot, a silent testament to generations of Boones who had lived and died on this land. She'd stood there, dry-eyed and resolute, promising herself that she would fight for the ranch, for their legacy, for everything he believed in, even if he'd been wrong. The letter detailed the outstanding debt, a sum so staggering it made her stomach clench. It was a debt she knew about, a shadow that had loomed over them for years, a secret her father had guarded closely, believing he could outrun it. He hadn't, and now, the shadow had caught up, threatening to engulf her. She looked up at Jed, her voice surprisingly steady. "How long?" He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze finally meeting hers. 30 days, Miss Delilah. The notice says 30 days to settle the debt, or the ranch goes to auction. 30 days. A month to find a miracle. A month to salvage a lifetime of work and struggle. A month to save her home. Jed cleared his throat. There's something else, Miss Delilah. The debt isn't owed to the bank, not directly. It's been bought. Delilah frowned. Bought? By whom? He hesitated, his eyes darting towards the horizon as if searching for an escape from the uncomfortable truth.
Beau Landry.
The name hit her like a physical blow.
Beau Landry.
The man was a legend in these parts, a whisper in the saloons, a shadow in the canyons. He was known for his ruthlessness, his unwavering determination, and his uncanny ability to collect what he was owed. He was a man who dealt in debts and whispers, a man who built his empire on the broken dreams of others. He was also, she recalled with a shiver, devastatingly handsome, with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a smile that could charm the devil himself. She'd seen him once, years ago, at a cattle auction in San Antonio. He'd been younger then, but the intensity in his gaze, the predatory grace in his movements, had stayed with her. Landry, she breathed, the name tasting like dust and ashes in her mouth. Jed nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of pity and something akin to fear. He's a hard man, Miss Delilah. I don't know what to tell you. He didn't need to. She knew. She knew the stories. She knew the whispers. She knew that Beau Landry rarely gave second chances. He collected what was his, and he did it with a cold efficiency that bordered on cruelty. As Jed rode away, leaving her standing alone in the gathering dusk, Delilah felt a profound sense of isolation. The vastness of the ranch, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to mock her, a reminder of everything she was about to lose. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint, mournful cry of a distant coyote. She crumpled the letter in her fist, the paper crinkling like the fragile bones of a dying bird. 30 days. And Bo Landry. The odds were stacked against her, a mountain she couldn't possibly climb. But Delilah Boone was not a woman who gave up easily. She'd faced hardship before, weathered storms that would have broken lesser women. She'd learned to be tough, to be resilient, to fight for what she believed in. And she believed in this ranch. She believed in the legacy of her family, in the sweat and tears that had been poured into this land. She believed, with a fierce, unwavering conviction, that she would find a way, even if it meant facing Bo Landry, the man who held her fate in his hands. Even if it meant staring into those stormy eyes and bargaining for her life, for her home, for everything she held dear. She just had to find something, anything. A hidden loophole, a forgotten agreement, anything. Because losing was not an option. The thought was simply too heavy to bear. Bo Landry would see. She would make sure of it. She would make everyone see. Chapter 2. A bargain struck in dust. The ride to Landry's ranch was a blur of sun-scorched earth and swirling dust. Delilah had chosen her sturdiest mare, a chestnut named Belle, who possessed a stubborn streak that matched her own. The journey took the better part of a day, each mile a testament to the vastness of the Texas landscape and the growing knot of dread in Delilah's stomach. Landry's spread was different from her own. Where the Boone Ranch felt wild and untamed, clinging to a rugged, natural beauty, Landry's was an exercise in controlled power. Fences stretched as far as the eye could see, meticulously maintained, enclosing herds of sleek, well-fed cattle. The main house, a sprawling adobe structure, sat atop a gentle rise, overlooking the valley like a hawk surveying its domain. It was a place built on success, on wealth, on the ruthless acquisition of everything it desired. As she approached the house, two ranch hands, their faces weathered and unreadable, intercepted her. They were polite but firm, their hands resting casually on the holsters of their guns. Delilah stated her name and her purpose, her voice betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. "Mr. Landry is expecting you, Miss Boone," one of the men said, his voice a low drawl. He gestured towards the house. "He's in the study." The interior of the house was cool and dim, a stark contrast to the blazing heat outside. Thick adobe walls kept out the sun, and the air smelled faintly of leather and old wood. A Mexican woman, her face etched with lines of quiet dignity, led Delilah through a series of hallways, their footsteps echoing on the polished tile floor. The study was a masculine domain, dominated by a massive oak desk and walls lined with books. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, despite the summer heat, casting flickering shadows on the room's rich furnishings. Bo Landry stood by the window, his back to the room, gazing out at his empire. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broad and powerful beneath a finely tailored shirt. He turned as she entered, and Delilah felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a primal awareness, a recognition of a force to be reckoned with. His eyes, that stormy gray she remembered, were even more intense up close, holding a depth of experience, of hardness, that sent a shiver down her spine. His face, tanned and lean, was etched with the lines of a life lived outdoors, a life lived on the edge. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, a pale crescent that hinted at a past filled with conflict. He didn't smile. He simply studied her, his gaze assessing, calculating, taking in every detail of her appearance, from her worn riding boots to the determined set of her jaw. She met his gaze unflinchingly, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to show any weakness. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. I've been expecting you. Mr. Landry, she replied, her voice steady. I believe you have something that belongs to me. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. Do I now? The deed to my ranch. My father's debt. You hold it. He moved towards the desk, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He picked up a stack of papers, the very papers that held her future, and riffled through them casually.
Yes.
The Boone Ranch. A fine piece of land, if a bit neglected. Delilah bristled at the insult. It's been in my family for generations. We've worked hard to keep it. And yet, he said, his voice laced with a hint of mockery, your father managed to gamble it away. She clenched her fists, fighting to control her temper. My father made mistakes. But that doesn't give you the right to take our home. He leaned back against the desk, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. I have every right, Miss Boone. I bought the debt. It's a legal transaction. You have 30 days to pay it, or the ranch becomes mine. I don't have that kind of money, she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. He shrugged, a gesture of indifference that infuriated her. Then I suggest you find it, or make other arrangements. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Delilah felt a flush of anger rise to her cheeks. What kind of arrangements? He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down her spine. I'm a businessman, Miss Boone. I'm always open to negotiation. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on the curve of her neck, the swell of her breasts beneath her simple cotton shirt. Your daddy owed me plenty, sugar, he murmured, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. But I reckon you might be worth more than the land. The words were a slap in the face, a blatant disregard for her dignity, for her humanity. Delilah felt a surge of rage, so intense it made her tremble. She wanted to lash out, to scream, to claw at his smug, handsome face. But she knew she couldn't. She was at his mercy. He held all the cards. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, to think strategically. She had to find a way to turn this situation to her advantage, to appeal to something other than his base desires. I'm not for sale, Mr. Landry, she said, her voice cold and hard. But I am willing to work. I'll work off the debt. I'll do whatever it takes to keep my ranch. He laughed, a low, throaty sound that grated on her nerves. Work? You? A woman? On a ranch like this? I've worked on a ranch my whole life, she retorted, her chin lifting defiantly. I know cattle. I know horses. I know the land. I'm not afraid of hard work. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowed, assessing her sincerity. She could see the doubt in his gaze, the skepticism. He didn't believe her. He thought she was weak, a fragile woman who would crumble under the pressure. Very well, Miss Boone, he said finally, a glint of challenge in his eyes. I'll make you a deal. You work for me. For 30 days. You prove your worth. And if, at the end of those 30 days, I deem your work satisfactory, I'll consider reducing the debt. It wasn't a full reprieve, not a guarantee, but it was something. A sliver of hope in the darkness. A chance to fight for her home. The smirk was still playing on his lips, but for once, Delilah didn't flinch. And if I refuse? She asked, although she already knew the answer. He shrugged. Then the ranch is mine. Simple as that. She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. I accept your deal, Mr. Landry. I'll work for you, and I'll prove to you that I'm worth more than you think. The dust swirled around her boots as she walked away, leaving Beau Landry standing in the shadow of his opulent study, the scent of leather and old wood mixing with a sudden, potent hint of something wilder, something untamed. Something he was not sure he was going to contain. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unworn Spurs. The first day dawned with a sky the color of faded denim, the sun a hazy promise behind a veil of high clouds. Delilah awoke in a small, sparsely furnished room above the stables, the scent of hay and horses a familiar comfort. It wasn't the room she'd grown up in, with its worn patchwork quilt and the view of the sprawling oak tree, but it was a roof over her head, a temporary reprieve from the uncertainty that gnawed at her. She dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn the day before, her movements stiff and sore from the long ride. She hadn't brought much with her, just a small satchel containing a few essentials, a change of clothes, her father's worn leather-bound journal, and a silver locket containing a faded photograph of her mother. The locket was her most treasured possession, a tangible link to the woman she'd barely known, a woman who had died giving birth to her. She found the ranch hands already at work, their movements practiced and efficient. They greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their eyes assessing her, wondering what the boss's new arrangement was all about. Delilah ignored their stares, focusing instead on finding Beau Landry. He was in the corral, working with a young colt, his movements fluid and graceful, his voice a low murmur of encouragement. The colt, a fiery chestnut with a white blaze, was skittish and nervous, its eyes rolling wildly. But Landry seemed to have a calming effect on the animal, his touch gentle but firm, his presence radiating a quiet authority. Delilah watched him for a moment, admiring his skill, his connection with the animal. It was a side of him she hadn't expected, a glimpse of something softer beneath the hard exterior. It was also, she realized, a dangerous distraction. She couldn't afford to be charmed by him, to be swayed by his unexpected gentleness. She had to remember why she was here, what was at stake. He noticed her standing there, his eyes meeting hers across the corral. He didn't smile, but a flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or challenge crossed his face. "You're up early, Miss Boone," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I'm used to early mornings," she replied, walking towards him. "What do you want me to do?" He turned back to the colt, his hands stroking its neck. "You said you know cattle. You said you know horses. Prove it." He gestured towards a group of horses milling nervously in a separate pen. "Those are new arrivals. Wild mustangs. We need to break them, get them ready for work. That's your job." Delilah's heart sank. Breaking wild mustangs was a tough job, even for experienced ranch hands. It required strength, skill, and a deep understanding of horse behavior. It was also dangerous, with the risk of being thrown, kicked, or trampled. She looked at the horses, their eyes wild and untamed, their bodies tense with fear and suspicion. She knew she could do it. She'd broken horses before, on her own ranch. But these were different. These were Landry's horses, and he was watching her, waiting for her to fail. "I'll need some help," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. "Help? You said you could handle it." "I can," she retorted. "But it's faster with two people. And safer." He studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing her. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll assign you one of the hands. But don't expect any special treatment, Miss Boone. You're here to work, just like everyone else." He called over one of the hands, a young man named Caleb, who looked at her with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Caleb was lean and wiry, with a quiet demeanor and eyes that held a surprising depth of understanding. He wasn't as overtly hostile as some of the other hands, but he wasn't exactly welcoming either. "Caleb, you'll be working with Miss Boone," Landry said. "She's going to be breaking those mustangs. Help her out, but don't do her work for her." Caleb nodded, his gaze meeting Delilah's briefly. "Yes, sir." Landry turned back to Delilah. "Don't disappoint me, Miss Boone." He walked away, leaving her standing there with Caleb and the wild mustangs, the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. She had to do this. She had to prove herself. She had to show Landry that she wasn't just a woman, that she was a boon, and that she wouldn't be broken. She spent the rest of the day working with Caleb, their efforts slow and painstaking. The mustangs were wary, resisting their attempts to approach them, to touch them, to gain their trust. Delilah spoke to them in soothing tones, her voice a constant presence, a reassurance in their fear-filled world. She used her body language, her movements, to communicate her intentions, to show them that she wasn't a threat. It was exhausting work, both physically and mentally. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the dust coated her skin, her hair, her clothes. Her muscles ached, and her hands were raw from handling the ropes. But she didn't complain. She didn't show any weakness. She kept going, driven by a stubborn determination to succeed. Caleb, she discovered, was a surprisingly good partner. He was quiet and unassuming, but he knew horses. He had a natural empathy for the animals, a gentle touch that seemed to calm their fears. He didn't say much, but he watched her closely, offering subtle suggestions, anticipating her needs. By the end of the day, they had managed to halter 2 of the Mustangs, a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but a significant step forward. Delilah felt a surge of pride, a flicker of hope. She was making progress. She was proving herself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, she found herself alone with Caleb, tending to the horses. He was brushing down one of the Mustangs, his movements slow and rhythmic, his voice a low hum. "You're good with them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Delilah looked at him, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. You too." He shrugged. "I grew up around horses. My pa was a wrangler." "Mine too," she said, a wistful smile touching her lips. "He taught me everything I know." He glanced at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "It's hard, losing your pa," Delilah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "It is." They stood there for a moment, sharing a silent understanding, a connection forged in the shared experience of loss and the love of horses. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the soft breathing of the animals and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "He's watching you, you know," Caleb said, his voice low. Delilah knew who he meant. "Landry?" He nodded. "He watches everyone. He doesn't miss much." She sighed. "I know."
He's a hard man, Caleb said.
"But he's fair. In his own way." Delilah wasn't so sure. She'd seen the ruthlessness in his eyes, the cold calculation. She didn't trust him. But she also knew that she had no choice but to play his game, to abide by his rules. "I just need to get through these 30 days, she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "I need to save my ranch." Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and respect. "I hope you do, Miss Boone. I really do." He paused, and added almost to himself. "We all do." The weight of unspoken words, of shared hopes and fears, hung in the air, heavier than the spurs she had yet to earn, heavier than the debt she was fighting to repay. She had an ally, at the very least. Chapter 4. Echoes of Laughter, Ghosts of Regret. The second week bled into the third, marked by a relentless rhythm of work and a growing tension that crackled in the air like static before a storm. Delilah fell into a routine, rising before dawn, working until sunset, and collapsing into bed exhausted, her body aching, her mind racing. She saw Beau Landry often, his presence a constant reminder of the precariousness of her situation. He would observe her from afar, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable, or he would engage her in brief, pointed conversations, testing her knowledge, probing for weaknesses. She learned to anticipate his moods, to read the subtle shifts in his body language, the flicker of his eyes, the tone of his voice. She learned that he was a man of contradictions, capable of both ruthless cruelty and unexpected kindness. He was demanding, pushing her to her limits, but he was also fair, acknowledging her successes, however grudgingly. One evening, after a particularly grueling day spent rounding up stray cattle, Delilah found herself alone in the ranch kitchen, preparing a simple meal for herself. The cook, a stout, good-natured woman named Maria, had taken the night off, leaving Delilah to fend for herself. As she was stirring a pot of beans, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see Beau Landry standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. "You're still here," he said, his voice a low rumble. Delilah shrugged. "Where else would I be?" He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked into the kitchen, his movements fluid and graceful. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and horses that clung to him.
"I thought you might have run off by now," he said.
"Given up." I told you. I'm not a quitter, she replied, her voice steady. He raised an eyebrow.
Most women would have.
I'm not most women, she retorted. He smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. No, you're not, Miss Boone. You're different. He reached out and touched a stray strand of hair that had escaped her braid, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, stepping back from his touch. He let his hand drop, his eyes studying her intently. You remind me of someone, he said, his voice softer now, almost wistful. Who? She asked, curious despite herself. He hesitated, a shadow passing over his face.
Someone I used to know.
A long time ago. He didn't elaborate, and Delilah didn't press him. She sensed that he was talking about something painful, something he didn't want to share. He changed the subject, gesturing towards the pot of beans. That smells good. Mind if I join you? Delilah was surprised by the request. She hadn't expected him to want to share a meal with her, especially not a simple, humble meal like this.
I don't have much, she said.
He shrugged. It's enough. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded.
All right.
They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of their forks against the plates and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Delilah found herself stealing glances at him, studying his face, trying to decipher the emotions that flickered behind his eyes. He was a handsome man, she couldn't deny that. But it was more than just his physical appearance that drew her attention. It was the sense of mystery that surrounded him, the hint of a past filled with both pain and passion. It was the way he looked at her, as if he saw something in her that no one else had ever seen. Tell me about your ranch, he said, breaking the silence. Delilah looked at him, surprised by the question. What do you want to know? Everything, he said. Tell me about your life there. Your family. Your dreams. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want to give him any more ammunition to use against her. But she also found herself wanting to share, to connect with him on some level. She started slowly, telling him about the land, the rolling hills, the sprawling oak trees, the creek that ran through the property. She told him about her father, his love of horses, his reckless gambling, his unwavering belief in the future. She told him about her mother, the woman she'd never known, the woman whose memory she cherished. As she spoke, she realized that she was talking about more than just the ranch. She was talking about her life, her hopes, her fears. She was revealing a part of herself that she'd kept hidden from the world, a part of herself that was vulnerable and raw. He listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't offer any empty platitudes. He simply listened, and in his silence, she found a strange sense of comfort. When she falls quiet, with her eyes transfixed by a memory, she's surprised to find him so attentive. And what about your dreams, Miss Boone? He asked, his voice soft. What do you want for the future? She looked at him, her eyes searching his. I want to keep my ranch, she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. I want to honor my family's legacy. I want to make a life for myself, on my own terms. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. And what about love, Miss Boone? Do you dream of that too? The question caught her off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think about love, about marriage, about a family of her own. It had always seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford, a distraction from the more pressing concerns of survival. I don't know, she said, her voice faltering. I haven't really thought about it. He leaned closer, his gaze locking with hers. Maybe you should, he said, his voice a husky whisper. Maybe you should start thinking about it. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Delilah felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a warmth spreading through her body. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the intensity of his gaze, of the way his presence seemed to fill the room. It echoed in her ears. The shared meal, the unexpected intimacy, the ghosts of laughter and regret that seemed to dance in the air around them, had created a connection, a fragile bond that threatened to unravel everything. Delilah would have to tread very carefully if her plans were to succeed. Chapter 5. beneath a sky of burning stars. The days continued to melt into one another, each sunrise bringing a renewed sense of urgency, each sunset a reminder of the dwindling time. Delilah worked tirelessly, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion, determined to prove her worth to Beau Landry. She broke horses, mended fences, herded cattle, and performed any other task that was asked of her, no matter how difficult or demanding. She did it all with a quiet determination, a fierce pride that refused to be broken. She saw less of Landry during this period. He was often away, tending to business in other parts of the county, or meeting with potential buyers for his cattle. But even when he wasn't physically present, his presence loomed over her, a constant pressure, a silent challenge. One evening, as Delilah was returning to the stables after a long day spent searching for a lost calf, she found Landry waiting for her. He was leaning against the fence, his silhouette outlined against the fiery hues of the setting sun. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking panorama of orange, red, and purple that stretched as far as the eye could see. "You found it," he said, his voice a low rumble. Delilah nodded, her body aching with fatigue. "It had wandered into a ravine. Took me a while to get it out." He pushed himself off the fence and walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes studying her intently. "You're tired," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm fine," she replied, trying to mask the exhaustion in her voice. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers brushing against her skin. She flinched at his touch, but he didn't withdraw his hand. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said. "You need to rest." "I can't," she said, her voice tight. "I have too much to do." "You've done enough," he said. "You've proven yourself, Delilah." The words caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on proving her worth, on meeting his expectations, that she hadn't allowed herself to believe that she might actually succeed. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines, making him look younger, more approachable. "I mean," he said, "that I'm impressed. You've worked harder than any man on this ranch. You've shown courage, determination, and a skill with animals that I haven't seen in a long time." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I'm going to reduce the debt, Delilah. Significantly." Relief washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. She'd done it. She'd saved her ranch. Or at least, she'd taken a significant step toward saving it. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his smile fading. "But," he added, his voice hardening slightly, "there's still a considerable amount to be paid." Delilah's heart sank. She'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he would forgive the entire debt. But she knew that was unrealistic. She still had a long way to go. "I know," she said, her voice resigned. "I'll keep working. I'll pay it off, eventually." He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "There might be another way," he said, his voice low. Delilah's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was suggesting. She'd seen it in his eyes, felt it in his touch, heard it in the unspoken words that hung between them. What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. "Marry me, Delilah," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "Marry me, and the debt will be forgiven. The ranch will be yours, free and clear." The proposal hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications, with the weight of her past, her present, and her future. The sky above them had shifted from fiery hues to a deep, velvety blue, studded with a million burning stars. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind and the beating of her own heart. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to decipher the emotions that flickered beneath the surface. She saw desire, yes, but she also saw something else, something deeper, something that resonated with her own hidden longings. She saw a loneliness, a vulnerability, a yearning for connection. She was torn. Part of her wanted to reject his offer outright, to refuse to be bought and sold like a piece of property. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to rail against the injustice of it all. But another part of her, a part she'd tried to suppress, a part she'd barely acknowledged, felt a pull towards him, a connection that defied logic, that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. She saw a future, a possibility, a chance for something more than just survival. She was under no illusions. She knew that he was a hard man, a man with a past, a man who could be ruthless and unforgiving. But she also saw a strength, a resilience, a capacity for love that she hadn't expected. And his proposition, while outrageous, did solve her problems. The stars seemed to burn brighter, their light reflecting in his eyes, in the tears that welled up in her own. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't go back, that she had to move forward, that she had to make a choice. The decision would alter the course of everything. She was trapped by the vast, starlit sky and the man that offered her everything and nothing at all. Chapter 6. The Serpent in the Cottonwood. Delilah spent the next few days in a state of turmoil, wrestling with Beau Landry's proposal. She avoided him as much as possible, seeking refuge in the solitude of the stables or the vast expanse of the ranch. She needed time to think, to sort through her conflicting emotions, to make a decision that would change the course of her life. She confided in Caleb, sharing her dilemma with him in hushed whispers under the cover of darkness. He listened patiently, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding, a shared knowledge of the hardships of life on the frontier. "It's a hard choice, Miss Delilah," he said, his voice low. "But it's your choice. No one else can make it for you." "I know," she said, her voice heavy with uncertainty. "But what if I make the wrong choice? What if I regret it?" He shrugged. "There's no guarantees in life, Miss Delilah. You just gotta do what you think is best and hope for the best." His words offered little comfort, but she appreciated his honesty, his lack of judgment. He didn't try to sway her one way or the other. He simply listened and offered his support. She also sought solace in her father's journal, the worn leather-bound book that contained his thoughts, his dreams, his regrets. She read through the entries, searching for guidance, for some sign of what he would have wanted her to do. His handwriting was messy and erratic, filled with misspellings and grammatical errors, but his voice came through clearly, his love for the ranch, his unwavering belief in the future, his regret for the mistakes he'd made. In one entry, he wrote about her mother, about how much he'd loved her, about how her death had left a void in his life that he'd never been able to fill. He wrote about his hopes for Delilah, his desire for her to find happiness, to have a family, to carry on the Boone legacy. As Delilah read his words, she realized that her father, despite his flaws, had always wanted what was best for her. He'd made mistakes, yes, but he'd loved her, and he'd wanted her to be happy. And that, she realized, was what she wanted too. She wanted to be happy. She wanted to have a life filled with love, with purpose, with meaning. She wanted to honor her family's legacy, to keep the ranch alive, to build a future for herself. But could she find that happiness with Beau Landry? Could she build a life with a man who was so different from her, a man who carried such a heavy burden of the past? A man of whom she was still more than a little afraid. She decided to confront him, to talk to him, to try to understand him better. She found him in the study, the same room where he'd made his proposal, the room that held the scent of leather and old wood, the room that seemed to embody his power and his control. He was standing by the window, looking out at the ranch, his silhouette framed against the afternoon light. He turned as she entered, his eyes meeting hers, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I needed time to think," she replied, her voice steady. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "And have you come to a decision?" She took a deep breath. "I have some questions." He gestured towards a chair.
"Seat."
She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "Why me?" she asked. "Why did you choose me?" He hesitated, a shadow passing over his face. "I told you, you remind me of someone. Someone you loved? She asked, her voice soft. He nodded, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if he were looking at something far away, something lost in the past. Her name was Sarah. She was everything to me. What happened to her? Delilah asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own.
She died.
A fever. It took her quickly. Delilah felt a pang of sympathy for him, a recognition of the shared experience of loss. She knew what it was like to lose someone you loved, to feel the emptiness, the grief, the despair. I'm sorry, she said, her voice sincere. He shrugged, a gesture of dismissal, as if he were trying to brush away the pain. It was a long time ago. But you still love her, Delilah said, her voice knowing. He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. And you see her in me?
She asked.
He nodded.
You have her spirit.
Her strength. Her fire. Delilah felt a strange mix of emotions. She was flattered that he saw those qualities in her, but she was also wary of being compared to a ghost, to a woman he'd loved and lost. I'm not her, Beau, she said, her voice firm.
I'm Delilah.
I'm my own person. He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I know, he said. And that's what I like about you. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. I'm not asking you to be her, Delilah. I'm asking you to be you.
To be my wife.
To build a life with me. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. I know I'm not an easy man. I have a past. I have baggage. But I can offer you security. I can offer you a future. I can offer you everything. Delilah felt a shiver run down her spine. His words were tempting, seductive, promising a life she'd only dreamed of. But she also knew that there were dangers, that there were risks, that there were secrets he was still keeping from her. As if to confirm her suspicions, a sudden noise outside the window startled them both. A branch scraped against the glass, followed by a low growl. Landry moved quickly, pulling a gun from a drawer in his desk. Stay here, he said, his voice sharp. He went outside, his movements cautious and alert. Delilah watched him from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw him approach a large cottonwood tree, his gun raised, his eyes scanning the branches. She saw a flash of movement, a dark shape slithering along a branch. A snake. A large rattlesnake, its head raised, its fangs bared. Landry fired his gun, the shot echoing through the air. The snake fell to the ground, its body writhing in its death throes. Landry stood there for a moment, his gun still raised, his body tense. Then, he slowly lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping with relief. He looked back at the window, his eyes meeting Delilah's. He holstered his gun and walked back towards the house, his face grim. The serpent in the cottonwood, a symbol of danger, of hidden threats, of the precariousness of life on the frontier, had shattered the illusion of peace, of a simple choice. There was still something lurking. Chapter 7. Scars that whisper of the past. The incident with the rattlesnake unsettled Delilah, adding another layer of complexity to her already fraught decision. It served as a stark reminder of the dangers of this untamed land, and perhaps of the dangers of trusting Beau Landry completely. The seemingly idyllic life he offered was, like the ranch itself, under constant threat from unseen forces. Later that evening, as Delilah was tending to Belle in the stables, Caleb approached her. He seemed unusually agitated, his normally calm demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. Miss Delilah, he said, his voice low and urgent, I need to talk to you. In private. Delilah looked at him, concerned. What is it, Caleb? He glanced around nervously, as if checking to see if they were being watched. Not here. Meet me by the creek, at the old abandoned shack. In an hour. Delilah nodded, her curiosity piqued. All right. An hour later, she found Caleb waiting for her at the designated spot. The shack was a dilapidated structure, its walls crumbling, its roof sagging, a relic of a bygone era. The creek gurgled softly nearby, its sound a soothing counterpoint to the tension in the air. What's wrong, Caleb? Delilah asked, her voice hushed. He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's about Mr. Landry," he said. "There's something you need to know." Delilah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd sensed that Landry was hiding something, that there were secrets in his past that he hadn't revealed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words.
He wasn't always like this, he said.
"He wasn't always so hard. So cold." "What do you mean?" Delilah asked. "He used to be different," Caleb said. "He used to be happy. He had a brother, you see. A younger brother, named Ethan. They were close, inseparable. They did everything together." Delilah listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd never heard Landry mention a brother. "What happened to him?" she asked. Caleb's eyes filled with tears.
"He died.
"A few years back. It was a terrible accident." "What kind of accident?" Delilah pressed. Caleb swallowed hard. They were riding together, chasing a stray steer. Ethan's horse stumbled, threw him.
He hit his head on a rock.
He died instantly." Delilah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry." Caleb nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "It changed Mr. Landry. It broke him. He blamed himself. He said he should have been there, he should have been able to save him. But it wasn't his fault," Delilah said. Caleb shook his head.
"He doesn't see it that way.
He carries that guilt with him, every day. It's eaten him up inside." He then adds in a hushed whisper, "Some say it was no accident." Delilah felt a surge of empathy for Landry, a deeper understanding of the pain that he carried. She could see now why he was so guarded, so closed off, so reluctant to let anyone get close to him. He was afraid of losing someone else he loved. He was afraid of being hurt again. Delilah frowned. "What do you mean?"
Who would say that?
"There were rumors," Caleb said, his voice hesitant. "Whispers."
People said
that Ethan had been seeing a woman. A married woman. The wife of a powerful rancher named Silas Thornton. Delilah's eyes widened. "And they think Thornton killed him?" Caleb nodded. "Thornton was a jealous man, a violent man. He had a reputation. And Ethan was young, reckless. He didn't always think things through." "But there's no proof," Delilah said. Caleb shrugged. "No proof. Just rumors." But the rumors, they persisted. And Mr. Landry, he believes them. He's never forgiven Thornton. He's sworn revenge. Delilah felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She'd stepped into a hornet's nest, a web of secrets and lies and long-standing feuds. She thought she was simply bargaining for her ranch, but she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous, far more complex. "Why are you telling me this, Caleb?"
she asked.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sincerity that she couldn't doubt. "Because I care about you, Miss Delilah. And I care about Mr. Landry, too, in my own way. I don't want to see either of you get hurt." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "Be careful, Miss Delilah. Be very careful. This isn't just about a debt anymore. It's about something much bigger, much more dangerous." He slipped away into the darkness, leaving Delilah standing alone by the creek, the sound of the water, a rushing torrent in her ears. The scars of Beau Landry's past, whispered on the wind, had revealed a truth far more complex than she could have imagined. She was no longer just a woman trying to save her ranch. She was caught in a crossfire of old hatreds, of vengeance, of a love lost, and a brother mourned. The weight of it all was immense, a heavy cloak settling around her shoulders. It was more than a rattlesnake in the grass she needed to be worried about. Chapter 8. A dance of defiance and desire. The revelation of Beau Landry's past and the simmering feud with Silas Thornton cast a long shadow over Delilah's thoughts. She found herself viewing Landry with a mixture of pity, understanding, and a growing unease. She was drawn to his strength, his resilience, his hidden vulnerability, but she was also wary of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface, the potential for violence that seemed to simmer just below his controlled exterior. She tried to maintain a distance, to focus on her work, to avoid any unnecessary interactions with him. But it was difficult. He was everywhere, his presence a constant reminder of the bargain they'd struck, of the decision she still had to make. One afternoon, as Delilah was working in the corral, training one of the mustangs, Landry approached her. He leaned against the fence, watching her, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice a low rumble. Delilah shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "I've been busy." "Busy avoiding me," he corrected. She didn't reply, focusing instead on the horse, her hands stroking its neck, her voice a soothing murmur. He pushed himself off the fence and walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Have you made a decision, Delilah?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the desire in his gaze, the longing, the vulnerability. But she also saw the shadows, the secrets, the potential for danger. "I don't know," she said, her voice hesitant. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers brushing against her skin. She flinched, but he didn't withdraw his hand. "Don't be afraid of me, Delilah," he said, his voice a husky whisper. "I won't hurt you." "It's not you I'm afraid of," she said, her voice barely audible. "What is it, then?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want to betray Caleb's confidence, but she also needed to understand the situation better, to know the risks involved. I've heard things," she said, her voice vague. "About your past. About your brother." His eyes darkened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. He let his hand drop, his body tensing. "Who told you?" he asked, his voice sharp. "It doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is it true?" He turned away, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he were looking at something far away, something lost in the past. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's true." "And Thornton?" she asked. "Do you believe he?" He cut her off, his voice harsh. "I know he did it. I may not have proof, but I know it in my gut. And you want revenge," she said, her voice stating a fact, not asking a question. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "He took my brother from me. He deserves to pay." Delilah felt a shiver run down her spine. She saw the darkness in him then, the potential for violence, the obsession that consumed him. "But that won't bring him back," she said, her voice soft. "It won't ease your pain." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "It might," he said. "It might be the only thing that does." He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. "Marry me, Delilah," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "Be my wife. Help me forget. Help me heal." His words were a plea, a desperate cry for help, for redemption. Delilah felt a surge of compassion for him, a desire to ease his pain, to help him find peace. But she also knew that she couldn't be his savior, that she couldn't fix him, that she couldn't erase the past. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the conflict in his gaze, the battle between darkness and light, between vengeance and forgiveness. She saw a man torn apart by grief, consumed by hatred, but also capable of love, of tenderness, of a deep yearning for connection. It was a dance of defiance and desire, a delicate balance between her own needs and his, between her fear and her attraction, between the safety of her ranch and the dangers of his world. The music was a haunting melody, a blend of sorrow and hope, of regret and possibility. The steps were uncertain, the rhythm unpredictable, the outcome unknown. She began to realize she cared for him. She closed the small distance, reaching to caress his cheek. His skin was rough beneath her fingertips. "I need you to promise me something, Bo," she whispered. "Promise me there will be no violence." "No revenge." He stared down at her, the storm clear in his magnificent eyes. It was a long moment before he nodded once. It wasn't nearly enough, but for now, Delilah chose to accept it. It was a start. Chapter 9. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. Delilah's conditional acceptance of Beau's proposal marked a turning point in their relationship. It was a fragile truce, a tentative step towards a shared future, built on a foundation of unspoken promises and lingering doubts. The air between them remained charged with a complex mix of desire, apprehension, and a growing sense of inevitability. The wedding was a small, private affair, held in the simple chapel of the nearby town. Only a handful of people were present: Caleb, Maria, a few of the ranch hands, and the circuit judge who had delivered the foreclosure notice to Delilah months earlier. The judge, a weathered man with kind eyes, seemed genuinely happy for Delilah, offering her a warm smile and a few words of encouragement. Delilah wore a simple white dress, borrowed from Maria, and a sprig of wildflowers in her hair. She didn't have a veil, or a bouquet, or any of the traditional trappings of a wedding. But she felt a sense of peace, a quiet joy, a flicker of hope for the future. Beau wore a dark suit, his usual rugged attire replaced by a more formal look. He looked handsome, but also uncomfortable, as if he were unused to such finery. He smiled. It reached his eyes. The ceremony was brief and simple, the vows exchanged in hushed tones, the words carrying the weight of their shared history, their uncertain future. As Beau slipped the simple gold band onto Delilah's finger, she felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a growing affection for the man who stood before her. After the ceremony, they returned to the Landry Ranch, where Maria had prepared a small feast. The ranch hands offered their congratulations, their initial suspicion replaced by a grudging respect for Delilah's resilience, her determination to save her ranch. As the evening wore on, Delilah found herself alone with Beau on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "Thank you," Delilah said, her voice soft. "For keeping your word." Beau nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I told you, I'm a man of my word." "But the debt," she said. "It's still a lot of money." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "It's forgiven, Delilah. As of today, you owe me nothing." She stared at him, surprised. "But you said I'd consider reducing it," he corrected. "And I have. To 0. Relief washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. She'd done it. She'd saved her ranch. And she hadn't had to sacrifice her soul in the process.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do it?" He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers brushing against her skin. "Because I want you to be happy, Delilah," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "Because I care about you." His words, spoken with such sincerity, touched her deeply. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the longing, the hope for a new beginning. She realized that he wasn't just doing this for her, he was doing it for himself, too. He was seeking redemption, a chance to escape the shadows of his past, a chance to find happiness. She leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. She was grateful for his generosity, his kindness, his willingness to give her a second chance. But she was also aware of the challenges that lay ahead, of the complexities of their relationship, of the secrets that still lurked beneath the surface. The price she thought she would pay had been freedom. She found herself starting to fall for him. It was subtle, but unmistakable. But the price, she would soon learn, was far greater than a simple exchange of land for loyalty. The cost of love, in this harsh and unforgiving land, was measured in trust, in sacrifice, in the willingness to confront the demons of the past and the uncertainties of the future. It was a price she wasn't sure she was ready to pay, a price that might demand more than she had to give. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, casting their ethereal glow upon the vast expanse of the ranch, Delilah felt a sense of foreboding, a premonition of the challenges that lay ahead. The peace she felt was fragile, the joy tempered by a lingering unease. The game was not over. It was only just beginning. And something, a whisper in her soul, told her she wasn't going to like what came next. Chapter 10. Where Rivers Run Red with Secrets. The first few weeks of Delilah's marriage to Beau were a strange mixture of quiet contentment and underlying tension. They settled into a routine, sharing meals, working alongside each other on the ranch, and slowly, tentatively, exploring the boundaries of their new relationship. Delilah found herself growing more comfortable with Beau, appreciating his quiet strength, his unexpected tenderness, his dry sense of humor. She also began to see glimpses of the man he had been before his brother's death, the man Caleb had described, the man who had been happy, carefree, and full of life. She saw it in the way he smiled at her sometimes, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, softening the hard lines of his face. She saw it in the way he interacted with the ranch hands, his tone less harsh, his demeanor more relaxed. She saw it in the way he cared for the animals, his touch gentle, his voice soothing. But the shadows of the past were never far away. Delilah could see the pain in his eyes, the grief that he still carried, the simmering anger that threatened to erupt at any moment. She knew that the feud with Silas Thornton was still unresolved, a festering wound that refused to heal. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Delilah decided to broach the subject. "Beau," she said, her voice hesitant, "what are you going to do about Thornton?" He turned to her, his eyes darkening, his jaw tightening. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," she said. "You still blame him for Ethan's death. You still want revenge." He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You promised me," she said, her voice soft. "You promised me there would be no violence." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said. "And I'm trying, Delilah. I really am. But it's not easy." "I know it's not," she said. "But you have to let it go, Beau. For your own sake. For our sake." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Can you let it go?" The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Delilah knew that he was asking her more than just a simple question. He was asking her to share his burden, to understand his pain, to accept his past. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I'm trying," she said, her voice sincere. "But it's hard to forget what he did. Or what they thought he did," she silently corrected. "He didn't just kill Ethan," Beau said, his voice raw with emotion. "He killed a part of me. He took away my future, my happiness, my hope." Delilah squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. "I know," she said. "But you have a new future now, Beau. You have me. You have the ranch. You have a chance to start over." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and doubt. "Do you really believe that, Delilah?" "I do," she said, her voice firm. "I have to." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, "for believing in me." They sat there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their bodies touching, their hearts beating in unison. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. But the peace was shattered by the sudden arrival of a rider, his horse galloping at full speed towards the ranch house. The rider was one of Beau's ranch hands, a young man named Jake. "Mr. Landry," Jake shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "There's trouble. At the river." Beau jumped to his feet, his eyes narrowed, his body tense. "What kind of trouble?" "It's Thornton," Jake said. "He's damming up the river. He's cutting off our water supply." Delilah felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. The confrontation she'd been dreading, the moment of truth that would test their fragile peace, their uncertain future. Beau's face was a mask of fury, his eyes blazing with anger. "Get the men," he said, his voice cold and hard. "We're going to the river." He turned to Delilah, his expression softening slightly. "Stay here," he said. "It's not safe." "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm going with you." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the unwavering resolve that mirrored his own. "All right," he said finally, "but stay close to me." They rode together, a small band of armed men, their horses galloping across the moonlit landscape. The air was thick with tension, with the anticipation of violence, with the scent of danger. Delilah's heart was pounding in her chest, her senses heightened, her mind racing. They reached the river, a scene of chaos unfolding before them. Thornton's men were working feverishly, building a dam of rocks and earth, blocking the flow of water. Beau's men were shouting, their voices raised in anger, their guns drawn. The river, once a source of life, of sustenance, was now a battleground, a symbol of the long-standing feud, of the hatred that ran as deep as the muddy water itself. The secrets, like the river, ran red, staining everything they touched. Chapter 11. The Unforgiving Gaze of Truth. The scene at the river was a powder keg waiting to explode. Beau and his men confronted Silas Thornton and his crew, the two groups facing each other across the rapidly forming dam, their anger palpable, their weapons drawn. The moon cast long, distorted shadows, making the scene appear even more menacing, more surreal. Silas Thornton was a large, imposing man, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes cold and ruthless. He was the embodiment of everything Delilah hated: arrogance, greed, a blatant disregard for the law and for the lives of others. Landry, Thornton sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. I should have known you'd be behind this. You have no right to dam the river, Thornton Beau said, his voice cold and hard. It's a shared resource. I have every right, Thornton retorted. This is my land, and I'll do what I please with it. The water belongs to everyone, Beau said. You're cutting off our supply, and the supply of other ranchers downstream. That's their problem, Thornton said, shrugging dismissively. I'm looking out for my own interests. You're a selfish, greedy bastard, Beau said, his voice trembling with rage. Thornton laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. And you're a pathetic, grieving fool. Still mourning your little brother? It's been years, Landry. Get over it. Beau's face went white, his eyes blazing with fury. He took a step forward, his hand hovering over his gun. Don't you dare speak about him, Beau said, his voice low and dangerous. Or what? Thornton challenged. You'll kill me? Like you killed him? The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation, with the weight of unspoken truths. Delilah felt a gasp escape her lips, her eyes widening in disbelief. Beau froze, his body rigid, his face a mask of shock and horror. What did you say? Thornton smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. You heard me, Landry. You killed your brother. You may have fooled everyone else, but I know the truth. You're lying, Beau said, his voice shaking. You're just trying to provoke me. Am I? Thornton asked. Ask your wife. Ask Delilah. She knows. Don't you, Delilah? All eyes turned to Delilah, her face pale, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt trapped, caught in a crossfire of lies and accusations, forced to confront a truth she'd tried to ignore, a suspicion she'd buried deep in her heart. She looked at Beau, his eyes pleading with her, begging her to deny it, to refute Thornton's claim. But she couldn't. She'd seen the doubt in Caleb's eyes, heard the whispers in the wind, felt the unease in her own soul. I don't know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I've heard things. Beau stared at her, his expression a mixture of betrayal and despair. You believe him? I don't want to believe him, she said, her voice choked with emotion. But there's too much we don't know. Too many unanswered questions. Thornton laughed, his voice echoing across the river. See, Landry? Even your own wife doesn't trust you. Beau turned back to Thornton, his eyes filled with a cold, deadly rage. He drew his gun, his movements swift and decisive. You're a dead man, Thornton, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Delilah screamed, her voice piercing the night.
Well, no.
But it was too late. Gunshots rang out, echoing across the river, mingling with the shouts of men, the screams of horses, the splash of water. Delilah watched in horror as Beau and Thornton exchanged fire, their bodies silhouetted against the moonlit sky. She saw Thornton fall, his body crumpling to the ground. She saw Beau stagger, his hand clutching his side, blood staining his shirt. She ran towards him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She reached him just as he collapsed, his body heavy in her arms.
Bo,
She cried, her voice filled with anguish. Oh, God! Bo, she cradled him in her arms, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with the blood that was seeping from his wound. She saw the pain in his eyes, the confusion, the fading light. Delilah, he whispered, his voice weak. I didn't shush, she said, her voice soothing.
don't talk.
Save your strength. She looked around desperately, searching for help. She saw Caleb running towards them, his face white with fear.
Caleb,
She shouted.
help me.
He's been shot. Caleb knelt beside them, his hands trembling as he examined Bo's wound. It's bad, Miss Delilah, he said. Real bad. We need to get him back to the ranch, she said. We need to get a doctor. They managed to get Bo onto his horse, Delilah supporting his weight, Caleb leading the way. They rode as fast as they could, the urgency of the situation driving them forward. But as they reached the ranch, Delilah knew that it was too late. Bo's breathing was shallow, his pulse weak, his eyes losing their focus. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and regret. Delilah, he whispered. I loved you, and then he was gone. His body went limp in her arms, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The unforgiving gaze of truth, reflected in the still waters of the river, had revealed a reality far more devastating than Delilah could have imagined. She was alone, once again, surrounded by death, by betrayal, by the consequences of a past that refused to stay buried. The river had indeed run red, staining everything it touched, including her heart. This time, however, it was different. It was a part of her that died with him. Chapter 12. A storm brewing on the horizon. Delilah was numb. The world around her seemed to move in slow motion, sounds muffled, colors muted. Bo's death had ripped a hole in her soul, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and confusion. She'd lost her husband, her partner, the man she'd begun to love, the man who had offered her a second chance at happiness. And she'd lost him in the most brutal, most devastating way possible, amidst a storm of violence and accusations. The funeral was a blur. The same faces that had attended their wedding were now present, their expressions somber, their words of condolence hollow and inadequate. Delilah stood by the graveside, dry-eyed and stoic, her heart a shattered wasteland. She felt nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. Caleb was a constant presence, his support unwavering, his quiet strength a source of comfort in the midst of her despair. He helped her with the arrangements, dealt with the authorities, shielded her from the prying eyes of the curious and the judgmental. The sheriff, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Brody, investigated the shooting. He questioned Delilah, Caleb, and the other ranch hands who had been present at the river. The evidence was clear. Bo had shot Thornton in self-defense after Thornton had provoked him, threatened him, and accused him of murdering his brother. Thornton's death, however, did little to ease Delilah's pain. It didn't bring Bo back. It didn't answer the questions that still lingered in her mind, the doubts that Thornton's accusations had planted. Had Bo really killed his brother? Was it an accident, as he'd always claimed, or was there a darker truth hidden beneath the surface? She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't know the whole story, that there were secrets still waiting to be uncovered. She felt a growing sense of unease, a suspicion that she'd been manipulated, used, caught in a web of lies and deceit. She returned to her father's journal, searching for answers, for some clue that might shed light on Bo's past, on his relationship with his brother, on the events that had led to Ethan's death. She found an entry, dated a few weeks before Ethan's death, that caught her attention. It was written in Bo's handwriting, not her father's. Ethan is playing with fire. He's seeing Thornton's wife, and he's not being careful. I'm worried about him. I'm afraid of what Thornton might do. I have to protect him. I have to keep him safe. Delilah's heart pounded in her chest as she read the words. Bo had known about Ethan's affair with Thornton's wife. He'd been worried about his brother, concerned about the potential consequences. He'd wanted to protect him. But had he protected him? Or had he eliminated him? The question haunted her, gnawing at her conscience, fueling her doubts. She couldn't reconcile the image of Beau as a loving, protective brother with the possibility that he'd been capable of such a cold-blooded act. She decided to confront Caleb, to share her suspicions with him, to seek his guidance. She found him in the stables, tending to the horses. "Caleb," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need to talk to you."
About Beau.
"About Ethan." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I know, Miss Delilah. I've been expecting this. I found something," she said, her voice trembling, "in my father's journal, an entry written by Beau. He knew about Ethan and Thornton's wife.
He was worried about him."
Caleb nodded, his expression grim. "I knew it," he said. "I suspected as much. But do you think—" Delilah couldn't bring herself to say the words. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Miss Delilah. I honestly don't know. Beau, he loved his brother. But he also had a temper. And he was possessive. Of the people he cared about. But why would he keep it a secret?" Delilah asked. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" "Maybe he was ashamed," Caleb said. "Maybe he was protecting Ethan's reputation. Or maybe he was protecting himself." Delilah felt a chill run down her spine. The possibility that Beau had lied to her, that he'd manipulated her, that he'd used her to achieve his own ends, was almost too much to bear. "I need to know the truth, Caleb," she said, her voice firm. "I need to find out what really happened." Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and determination. "I'll help you, Miss Delilah," he said. "I'll help you find out the truth. Whatever it takes." A storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm of revelations, of accusations, of long-buried secrets finally coming to light. Delilah knew that she was walking into a dangerous situation, that she might uncover truths that would shatter her world, that would destroy everything she thought she knew about Beau, about her ranch, about herself. But she had to do it. She had to find out the truth, for Beau's sake, for her own sake, for the sake of the future. The whispers, they felt and smelled of the oncoming storm. The horizon looked dark, even in the light of the full moon. Chapter 13. Whispers in the Wind, Lies in the Heart. Delilah and Caleb began their investigation, delving into the past, searching for clues, piecing together the fragments of a shattered truth. They started by talking to the ranch hands who had been with Beau and Ethan on the day of Ethan's death. They hoped to find someone who might have witnessed something, who might have seen or heard something that could shed light on the events of that fateful day. But the ranch hands were tight-lipped, reluctant to talk, their loyalty to Beau unwavering, even in death. They repeated the same story they'd told the sheriff years ago. Ethan's horse had stumbled, thrown him, and he'd hit his head on a rock. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. Delilah and Caleb were frustrated, their efforts stymied by a wall of silence, a conspiracy of loyalty that seemed impenetrable. They knew that someone was lying, that someone was hiding something, but they couldn't figure out who or why. They decided to expand their search, talking to people in town, to anyone who might have known Beau and Ethan, who might have had some insight into their relationship, into the feud with Thornton. They visited the local saloon, the watering hole where gossip flowed as freely as the whiskey, where secrets were whispered in dark corners, where truths were often distorted, embellished, or outright fabricated. They spoke to the bartender, a grizzled old man named Jedediah, who had been working at the saloon for decades, who had seen and heard it all. Jedediah remembered Beau and Ethan, remembered the rumors, the whispers, the accusations that had circulated after Ethan's death. They were close, those two, Jedediah said, his voice raspy with age. Always together. Beau was the older brother, the protective one. Ethan was the wild one, the charmer, the one who got into trouble. "Did you ever hear anything about Beau being involved in Ethan's death?" Delilah asked, her voice hesitant. Jedediah looked at her, his eyes narrowed, his expression guarded.
"There were rumors," he said.
"Whispers. People said that Beau was jealous of Ethan. Jealous of his charm, his popularity with the ladies, his relationship with Thornton's wife. But did you believe them?" Delilah pressed. Jedediah shrugged. "I don't know what to believe," he said. Beau was a hard man, a man with a temper. But he also loved his brother. I can't imagine him killing him. But it's possible, Delilah said, her voice barely a whisper. Jedediah nodded slowly. Anything's possible, Miss Delilah. Especially in this town. Especially when it comes to love and jealousy and revenge. Delilah and Caleb left the saloon, their hearts heavy with doubt, their minds filled with unanswered questions. They had learned nothing concrete, nothing definitive, but the whispers, the rumors, the suspicions were growing stronger, more persistent. They decided to visit Thornton's widow, Martha, hoping that she might be able to shed some light on the situation. They found her living in a small, modest house on the outskirts of town, her life a stark contrast to the opulent lifestyle she'd enjoyed as Thornton's wife. Martha was a frail, elderly woman, her face etched with lines of grief and regret. She welcomed Delilah and Caleb into her home, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Delilah explained their purpose, their desire to uncover the truth about Ethan's death, about Beau's involvement, about the long-standing feud between the two families. Martha listened intently, her expression guarded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I loved Ethan, she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with tears. He was a breath of fresh air in my life. He made me feel alive. He made me feel loved. Did you believe that Beau killed him? Delilah asked, her voice gentle. Martha hesitated, her gaze drifting towards the window, as if she were looking at something far away, something lost in the past. I don't know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to believe that it was an accident. I wanted to believe that Beau, that he wouldn't hurt his own brother. But you had doubts, Delilah said. Martha nodded slowly. There were things that didn't make sense. Things that Beau said, things that he did. He was so angry, so consumed by grief, so determined to blame Thornton. Did you ever talk to Beau about it? Delilah asked. I tried, Martha said. But he wouldn't listen. He shut me out. He blamed me, too. He said that I was responsible for Ethan's death, that I had tempted him, that I had led him astray. Delilah felt a surge of sympathy for Martha, a recognition of the shared experience of loss, of betrayal, of being caught in a web of lies and deceit. I'm sorry, Delilah said, her voice sincere. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. Martha smiled sadly. Thank you, she said. But it's too late for apologies. It's too late for regrets. The past is the past.
And it can't be changed.
But Delilah knew that the past could be changed, or, at least, the perception of the past could be changed. The truth could be uncovered, the lies exposed, the secrets revealed. And that was what she was determined to do, no matter the cost. The whispers in the wind, the lies in the heart, were beginning to coalesce, forming a clearer picture, a more disturbing truth. Delilah was getting closer to the answer, closer to the heart of the mystery, closer to the devastating reality that would shatter everything she thought she knew. She was heading towards a storm unlike any she had ever witnessed before. Chapter 14. The Tangled Web of Loyalty and Betrayal. Delilah and Caleb continued their investigation, their determination fueled by a growing sense of urgency, a need to uncover the truth before it was too late. They were walking a dangerous path, treading on sensitive ground, stirring up old resentments, risking the wrath of those who wanted the past to remain buried. They decided to focus on the day of Ethan's death, trying to reconstruct the events, to find any inconsistencies, any discrepancies, any clues that might have been overlooked. They returned to the scene of the accident, the spot where Ethan's horse had supposedly stumbled, where he'd fallen and hit his head on a rock. They examined the ground, searching for any sign of a struggle, any evidence that might contradict the official story. They found nothing. The ground was hard and dry, the rocks undisturbed, the landscape revealing nothing of the tragedy that had occurred there years ago. But as they were about to leave, Caleb noticed something, a small detail that Delilah had missed. A glint of metal, half buried in the dirt, partially obscured by a clump of grass. He knelt down, his fingers digging into the earth, pulling out the object. It was a small, silver buckle, intricately engraved with the initials EB. Delilah recognized it immediately. It was Ethan's. He'd worn it on his belt, a gift from Bo, a symbol of their brotherhood, their bond. Why would his buckle be here? Delilah asked, her voice puzzled. If he fell from his horse, wouldn't it still be on his belt? Caleb examined the buckle closely, his brow furrowed in concentration.
It's broken, he said.
The clasp is snapped, as if it was ripped off. Delilah felt a chill run down her spine. The buckle was a tangible piece of evidence, a clue that suggested a struggle, a fight, a scenario that contradicted the official story of an accidental fall. Someone ripped it off him, Delilah said, her voice barely a whisper. Someone fought with him. Or, Caleb said, his voice grim, someone staged the scene. Made it look like an accident. The implications were clear. Ethan hadn't died in a simple riding accident. He'd been murdered. And the prime suspect, the person who had the most to gain from his death, the person who had been consumed by grief and rage, the person who had sworn revenge, was Bo. Delilah felt a wave of nausea wash over her, her stomach churning, her head spinning. She couldn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. But the evidence was mounting, the clues pointing towards a truth that was too terrible to contemplate. She remembered Bo's words, his desperate plea on the night of the shooting. Delilah, had he been trying to tell her the truth? Had he been trying to confess? Or had he been trying to deceive her, to manipulate her, to the very end? She didn't know what to believe anymore. She felt lost, betrayed, confused, her world turned upside down, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She decided to confront the one person who might know the truth, the one person who had been closest to Bo, the one person who had been present on the day of Ethan's death, the ranch hand who had ridden with them, the man who had witnessed the accident. His name was Jed, and he still worked on the ranch, a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself, who rarely spoke, who seemed to carry a heavy burden of secrets. Delilah found him in the stables, tending to the horses. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Jed, she said, her voice low and urgent, I need to talk to you.
About Ethan.
About the day he died. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He knew why she was there. He knew what she was going to ask. I don't know anything, he said, his voice trembling. You were there, Jed, Delilah said, her voice firm. You saw what happened. You know the truth. He avoided her gaze, his hands fidgeting with the reins of the horse he was grooming. It was an accident, he said. Just like I told the sheriff. But it wasn't, was it? Delilah pressed. Ethan's buckle, we found it. It was broken. Ripped off.
Someone fought with him, Jed.
Someone killed him. Jed's body slumped, his shoulders sagging with defeat. He looked at Delilah, his eyes filled with tears. All right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. All right, I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking.
It wasn't an accident, he said.
Bo killed him. Delilah felt a gasp escape her lips, her body trembling with shock and disbelief. Even though she'd suspected it, hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing the truth confirmed, was devastating.
Why?
She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do it? He was jealous, he always had been. Delilah couldn't breathe. It seemed the whole world had tilted. Chapter 15. When trust breaks like brittle bone. Jed's confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a dark cloud that blotted out the sun, leaving Delilah in a chilling shadow of betrayal. The stables, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on her, the scent of hay and horses replaced by the stench of lies and deceit. He was jealous? Delilah repeated, her voice barely a whisper, trying to make sense of the words, trying to reconcile the image of Bo as a loving brother with the monstrous act he'd committed. Jed nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and shame. He always had been. Ethan was the golden boy. Everyone loved him. He was charming, handsome, good with horses, good with women. Bo was always in his shadow. But to kill him? Delilah said, her voice incredulous. His own brother? It wasn't planned, Jed said, his voice trembling. It had just happened. They were riding together, arguing about Thornton's wife. Bo knew about the affair. He'd warned Ethan to stay away from her, but Ethan wouldn't listen. And they fought? Delilah asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Jed nodded. They started shouting at each other, their voices getting louder and louder. Then Bo just snapped. He pushed Ethan off his horse. It happened so fast. Ethan fell, hit his head on a rock. He was dead before he even hit the ground. Delilah felt a wave of nausea wash over her, her stomach churning, her head spinning. She imagined the scene, the violence, the rage, the sudden, irreversible act that had changed everything. And you helped him cover it up? She asked, her voice accusing. Jed lowered his head, his shoulders slumping with guilt. I didn't know what to do, he said. Bo, he was my boss. He was like a brother to me, too. I felt like I had to protect him. Protect him? Delilah said, her voice rising in anger. By lying? By letting everyone believe it was an accident? By letting Thornton take the blame? I know it was wrong, Jed said, his voice pleading. But I was scared. Bo, he could be intimidating. He told me that if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it. Delilah felt a surge of disgust, a mixture of anger and pity for the man who stood before her, a man who had been complicit in a terrible crime, a man who had allowed his loyalty to be twisted into betrayal. You should have told the truth, she said, her voice cold and hard. You should have gone to the sheriff. I know, Jed said, his voice barely a whisper. But it's too late now. It's too late for regrets. It's not too late for justice, Delilah said, her voice firm. I'm going to the sheriff. I'm going to tell him everything. Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. No, Miss Delilah, he said. Please. You can't. Bo, he may be dead, but his influence, it still lingers. There are people who are loyal to him, people who would protect his memory. I don't care, Delilah said, her voice unwavering. I'm not afraid. The truth needs to come out. Ethan deserves justice. And I deserve to know the truth. She turned to leave, her steps determined, her heart heavy with a mixture of grief and resolve. But as she reached the door of the stables, she heard a noise behind her, a soft thud, a muffled groan. She turned around, her eyes widening in horror. Jed was lying on the ground, his body convulsing, blood pooling around his head. Standing over him was Caleb, his face a mask of rage, a heavy wrench clutched in his hand. Caleb! Delilah screamed. What have you done? Caleb looked at her, his eyes wild, his expression unhinged. He was going to betray him, he said, his voice hoarse. He was going to tell everyone. I had to stop him. Delilah stared at him, her mind reeling, her senses overwhelmed. She'd trusted Caleb. She'd confided in him. She'd believed he was her ally, her friend. But he was one of them. He was loyal to Bo, even in death. He was part of the conspiracy, part of the cover-up. You knew, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You knew all along. Caleb nodded, his expression defiant. I knew, he said. And I would do anything to protect Bo's memory. He was a good man, Miss Delilah. He didn't deserve to be slandered. Even after he was gone. Good man? Delilah said, her voice rising in anger. He killed his own brother. He lied to everyone. He manipulated me. He used me. And you helped him. He loved you, Miss Delilah, Caleb said, his voice pleading. He really did. In his own way. Love? Delilah said, her voice filled with scorn. That wasn't love, Caleb. That was obsession. That was control. That was evil. She backed away from him, her eyes filled with fear and disgust. She had to get out of there. She had to get to the sheriff. She had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But as she turned to run, she felt a sharp pain in her back, a searing agony that stole her breath, that sent her crashing to the ground. She looked down, her eyes widening in disbelief. A knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light of the stables, was protruding from her back. Caleb stood over her, his face a mask of regret, his eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Miss Delilah, he said, his voice trembling. But I can't let you do this. I can't let you destroy his legacy. Delilah felt her strength ebbing away, her vision blurring, her consciousness fading. She knew that she was dying, that she was about to join Beau and Ethan in the silent embrace of death. The trust she'd placed in others, the loyalty she'd expected, the love she'd hoped for, had all crumbled like brittle bone, leaving her broken, bleeding, betrayed. The tangled web of lies and deceit had finally ensnared her, pulling her down into the darkness, extinguishing the last flicker of hope. She was alone, utterly and completely. Chapter 16. A Reckoning Under the Desert Moon. Delilah lay on the stable floor, the cold, hard earth pressing against her cheek, the scent of hay and blood filling her nostrils. She felt weak, her life ebbing away, her vision blurring, her thoughts fragmented. She knew she was dying, that Caleb's betrayal had been the final, fatal blow in a long chain of deception and violence. But even as her consciousness faded, a spark of defiance, a flicker of resolve, remained. She wouldn't go quietly. She wouldn't let Caleb, or Beau's memory, or the tangled web of lies win. She would fight, even in her last moments, for the truth, for justice, for her own shattered soul. She heard voices, muffled and distant, as if coming from another world. She felt hands lifting her, carrying her, moving her through the darkness. She sensed the cool night air on her skin, the vast expanse of the starlit sky above her. She opened her eyes, her vision blurry, her focus wavering. She saw faces looming over her, their expressions concerned, their voices urgent. She recognized Maria, the cook, her face etched with worry, her hands tending to Delilah's wound. She saw other ranch hands, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "She's alive," Maria said, her voice trembling with relief.
But barely.
"We need to get her to the doctor."
How?
Delilah whispered, her voice weak, her throat parched. "Caleb, he's gone," one of the ranch hands said. "He ran off after he's nowhere to be found." Delilah tried to speak, to tell them what had happened, to expose Caleb's betrayal, to reveal the truth about Beau and Ethan. But the words wouldn't come. Her strength was failing, her consciousness slipping away. They carried her to a wagon, laying her gently on a bed of blankets. The journey to town was a blur of pain, of jolting movements, of fleeting images and fragmented thoughts. Delilah drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind struggling to hold onto reality, to fight against the encroaching darkness. She arrived to town. They carried her into the doctor's office, a small, dimly lit room filled with the scent of antiseptic and herbs. The doctor, a kind, elderly man with gentle hands, examined her wound, his expression grim. "She's lost a lot of blood," he said. The knife punctured a lung. It's touch and go." Delilah heard his words, but they seemed distant, unreal. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were floating above her body, watching the scene unfold from afar. The doctor worked feverishly, trying to stop the bleeding, to repair the damage, to save her life. Delilah felt his hands on her skin, the sting of the needle, the pressure of the bandages. But the pain was muted, the sensations dulled, as if her body were no longer her own. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness, to the inevitable. She was tired, so tired. She'd fought so hard, for so long, and she had nothing left to give. But then, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, a voice that stirred something deep within her, a spark of hope, a flicker of life. Delilah, she opened her eyes, her vision blurry, her focus wavering. She saw a figure standing over her, a silhouette against the dim light of the room. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow.
"Beau?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure moved closer, his face coming into focus. It was Beau.
Alive.
Scarred and beaten, but very much alive. Delilah stared at him, her eyes widening in disbelief, her heart pounding in her chest. "But you died," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw you, I held you," he smiled. A sad, weary smile. It's a long story, Delilah, he said, his voice hoarse. A story of lies and betrayal and redemption. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and strong, a lifeline in the darkness. I'm here, Delilah, he said. And I'm not going anywhere. The reckoning under the desert moon had arrived, not in the form of death, but in the form of a resurrected truth, a second chance, a love that had defied the odds, that had survived the storm. The lies were exposed, the secrets revealed, the betrayals laid bare. But amidst the wreckage, amidst the pain and the loss, a new hope emerged, a fragile promise of a future yet to be written. He had come back for her. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. She squeezed his hand and did not let go. Chapter 17. The bitter taste of redemption. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and revelation. Delilah, weak but alive, slowly regained her strength under the watchful care of the doctor and the constant presence of Beau. He rarely left her side, tending to her needs, sharing his story, piecing together the fragments of a shattered past. His story was a tale of deception and betrayal, of a carefully orchestrated plot to fake his death and expose the truth about Thornton and, ultimately, about his own brother's demise. He'd known for years that Thornton had been spreading rumors, whispering accusations, fueling the belief that Beau had killed Ethan. He'd also suspected that Thornton had played a more direct role in Ethan's death, that it hadn't been a simple accident. I needed proof, Beau explained, his voice raw with emotion. I needed evidence that would stand up in court, that would clear my name, that would bring Thornton to justice. He devised a plan, a risky, dangerous gamble that had involved faking his own death, staging the shooting at the river, and relying on Thornton's arrogance and greed to expose himself. I knew he'd gloat, Beau said. I knew he'd reveal something, say something that would incriminate him. And he did. He confessed, in front of witnesses, to provoking me, to threatening me, to accusing me of murder.
But the plan had gone awry.
Beau hadn't anticipated Caleb's betrayal, his fanatical loyalty, his willingness to kill to protect Beau's memory. Caleb, he was always devoted, Beau said, his voice filled with regret. He worshipped Ethan, and he saw me as a father figure. He couldn't accept the truth, the possibility that I might have been involved in Ethan's death. Caleb, it turned out, had been the one who had planted the broken buckle at the scene of the accident, years ago. He'd done it to protect Beau, to reinforce the story of an accidental fall, to deflect suspicion from his idol. He confessed everything, Beau said. After he stabbed you. He realized the enormity of what he'd done, the lives he'd ruined, the lies he'd perpetuated. He turned himself in to the sheriff. Delilah listened to Beau's story, her heart aching with a mixture of relief, anger, and a profound sadness. She was grateful that he was alive, that they had a second chance, but she was also devastated by the truth, by the extent of the deception, by the betrayal of someone she'd trusted. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you keep me in the dark?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what you might think of me. Afraid of the truth. But I deserve to know," she said, her voice rising in anger. "I was your wife. I was part of this." "I know," he said, his voice pleading. "And I'm sorry, Delilah. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I should have trusted you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the remorse in his gaze, the genuine regret, the pain that he carried. She knew that he was telling the truth, that he was truly sorry for what he'd done. "It's going to take time, Beau," she said, her voice soft. "Time to heal. Time to rebuild trust. Time to forgive." He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I know," he said. "And I'm willing to wait. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. To earn your trust back. To earn your love." The road to redemption was long and arduous, paved with difficult conversations, with painful revelations, with the slow, painstaking process of healing and forgiveness. Delilah and Beau faced their challenges together, their bond strengthened by the shared trauma, by the truth that had finally been revealed. They revisited the past, confronting the ghosts of Ethan and Thornton, laying to rest the lingering doubts and accusations. They worked together on the ranch, rebuilding their lives, their future, their love. The bitter taste of redemption lingered, a reminder of the mistakes that had been made, of the pain that had been inflicted, of the lives that had been lost. But amidst the bitterness, there was also a sweetness, a hope for a new beginning, a chance to build a future free from the shadows of the past. The ranch, once a symbol of debt and despair, was now a symbol of resilience, of forgiveness, of a love that had endured the ultimate test. The scars remained, visible and invisible, but they were also a testament to the strength of their bond, to their ability to overcome adversity, to find redemption in the most unexpected of places. It was a bittersweet taste, but one they could both live with. They had each other. Chapter 18. Sundown on a Shattered Dream. The months that followed were a period of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally. Delilah recovered from her stab wound, the scar a permanent reminder of Caleb's betrayal and the violence that had nearly claimed her life. Beau, too, bore scars, both visible and invisible, the marks of a past that continued to haunt him, despite his efforts to move forward. They worked together on the ranch, their shared labor a form of therapy, a way to reconnect, to rebuild trust, to forge a new future from the ashes of the old. They mended fences, both literally and figuratively, repairing the damage that had been done, both to the land and to their relationship. They talked, openly and honestly, about their feelings, their fears, their hopes for the future. Delilah shared her anger, her hurt, her sense of betrayal, her struggle to forgive Beau for keeping her in the dark, for putting her life at risk. Beau listened patiently, his remorse genuine, his desire to make amends unwavering. He acknowledged his mistakes, his flaws, his tendency to control and manipulate, his fear of vulnerability. "I was so focused on revenge," he said, his voice filled with regret. "On proving my innocence, on punishing Thornton, that I lost sight of everything else. I lost sight of you. You almost lost me," Delilah said, her voice soft but firm. "Literally." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "And I'll never forgive myself for that. For putting you in danger. For not trusting you." Slowly, gradually, they began to heal. The wounds were still raw, the scars still visible, but they were learning to live with them, to accept them as part of their shared history, a testament to the challenges they had overcome. They also had to deal with the legal ramifications of Beau's faked death and Caleb's actions. Caleb was arrested and charged with attempted murder and accessory to Ethan's death. He pleaded guilty, accepting his punishment, his misguided loyalty finally shattered by the weight of his crimes. The charges against Beau were dropped after. Delilah and Beau decided to honor Ethan's memory, not by perpetuating the cycle of violence and revenge, but by creating something positive, something that would benefit the community, something that would reflect the true spirit of the brother Beau remembered. They established a scholarship fund in Ethan's name, providing financial assistance to young people in the county who wanted to pursue a career in agriculture or ranching. It was a way to give back, to help others, to create a legacy of hope and opportunity from the ashes of tragedy and loss. As the seasons changed, as the harsh Texas landscape transformed from the scorching heat of summer to the crisp coolness of autumn, Delilah and Beau found a new rhythm, a new sense of peace. They had weathered the storm, survived the betrayal, emerged stronger and more resilient. But the past was never far away. The memories lingered, the shadows remained, the scars served as a constant reminder of the shattered dream, of the life they had envisioned, of the innocence they had lost. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Delilah felt a familiar pang of sadness, a longing for what might have been. "Do you ever think," she began, her voice hesitant, "about Ethan?" Beau finished, his voice soft. Delilah nodded. "About what our lives would have been like if he hadn't died. If none of this had happened." Beau sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I think about it all the time," he said. "I wonder what kind of man he would have become, what kind of life he would have had, whether he would have forgiven me." Forgiven you? Delilah asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. Bo looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. For not being able to save him, he said. For letting him down. Delilah reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. It wasn't your fault, Bo, she said, her voice firm. You did everything you could. It was a terrible accident. But I could have stopped him, Bo said, his voice trembling. I could have prevented him from seeing Thornton's wife. I should have, no, Delilah said, her voice sharp. You can't blame yourself, Bo. You can't live in the past. You have to move forward. We have to move forward. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against his. We have a future, Bo, she said. A new beginning. A chance to build something beautiful. Together. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the love in her gaze, the forgiveness, the unwavering belief in him. He saw a future, a possibility, a hope that he'd thought he'd lost forever. The sun was slowly disappearing. I love you, Delilah, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I love you, too, Bo, she said, her voice sincere. They sat there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their bodies touching, their hearts beating in unison. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, a reminder of the past, but also a promise of a new dawn, a new day, a new life. The dream was shattered, yes, but from the fragments, they would build something stronger, something more enduring, something that would stand the test of time. Chapter 19. Echoes of a Promise, a Glimmer of Hope. A year passed. The ranch thrived under Delilah and Bo's joint stewardship. The scars of the past, though still present, began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of peace and stability. Their relationship, tested by fire, had emerged stronger, deeper, more resilient. They had learned to trust each other implicitly, to communicate openly and honestly, to share their hopes and fears without reservation. The scholarship fund in Ethan's name had become a resounding success, providing opportunities for young people in the community, creating a positive legacy from a tragic past. Delilah and Bo took an active role in the fund, mentoring the recipients, sharing their knowledge and experience, fostering a sense of hope and possibility. They also made an effort to connect with the community, to heal the divisions that had been created by the long-standing feud with the Thorntons. They attended local events, supported local businesses, and extended a hand of friendship to those who had once been their enemies. Martha Thornton, Silas's widow, initially resisted their overtures, her heart still hardened by grief and resentment. But Delilah persisted, reaching out to her with kindness and compassion, sharing her own experience of loss and forgiveness. Slowly, gradually, Martha's defenses began to crumble. She saw the genuine remorse in Bo's eyes, the sincerity in Delilah's words, the shared pain that connected them across the divide of family history. One day, Martha visited the ranch unannounced. She stood on the porch, her frail figure silhouetted against the vast expanse of the Texas sky. I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice trembling, for the scholarship fund, for honoring Ethan's memory. Delilah smiled, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He was a good man, Martha, she said. Despite everything. Martha nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I know, she said. And I regret so much. Delilah and Bo invited her inside, offering her a cup of coffee, a listening ear, a shared space of healing and forgiveness. They talked for hours, sharing memories of Ethan, acknowledging the mistakes of the past, finding a common ground of humanity amidst the wreckage of their shattered lives. As Martha was leaving, she turned to Bo, her gaze searching his. I forgive you, Bo, she said, her voice soft but firm. For whatever part you played in Ethan's death. I forgive you. Bo's eyes filled with tears, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you, Martha, he said. That means more to me than you know. The act of forgiveness, offered and received, was a turning point, a release from the burdens of the past, a step towards a future free from the shackles of hatred and resentment. It was a testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. As the seasons continued to change, as the ranch flourished under their care, Delilah and Bo found a new rhythm, a new sense of purpose. They were no longer defined by the tragedy of the past, by the secrets and lies that had nearly destroyed them. They were defined by their love for each other, by their commitment to the ranch, by their desire to build a better future. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Delilah felt a familiar flutter in her stomach, a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time. She looked at Bo, her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Bo," she said, her voice hesitant, I think I'm pregnant." Bo stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and joy. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling. Delilah nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "I'm sure," she said. "I feel it. I know it." Bo pulled her close, his arms embracing her, his heart swelling with a love so profound, so overwhelming, it brought tears to his eyes. This is a miracle," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "A new beginning. A sign of hope." They held each other close, their bodies touching, their hearts beating in unison, their souls connected by a bond that had been forged in fire, tempered by adversity, strengthened by love. The echoes of a promise, whispered on the wind, had finally come to fruition. A glimmer of hope, once faint and fragile, now shone brightly, illuminating their path forward, guiding them towards a future filled with possibility, with joy, with the promise of new life. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. 9 months passed, a period of anticipation and preparation, of growing excitement and deepening love. Delilah's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body adapting to the new life growing within her, her spirit radiant with joy and hope. Bo was attentive and supportive, doting on her every need, his rough exterior softened by a tenderness that surprised even himself. The ranch continued to thrive, the land responding to their care, the animals flourishing under their watchful eyes. The community, too, seemed to heal, the wounds of the past slowly fading, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. As Delilah's due date approached, they prepared the ranch for the arrival of the baby, transforming one of the spare rooms into a nursery, filling it with handmade furniture, soft blankets, and colorful toys. They chose a name, Ethan, in honor of Bo's brother, a tribute to the past, a promise for the future. One warm spring evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, Delilah felt the first pangs of labor. She looked at Bo, her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "It's time," she said, her voice calm but firm. Bo's face went pale, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and joy. He'd been preparing for this moment for months, but now that it was here, he felt a surge of panic, a sense of inadequacy. Are you sure?" he asked, his voice trembling. Delilah smiled, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. "I'm sure," she said. "And I need you, Bo. I need you to be strong for me." He took a deep breath, his composure returning, his resolve strengthening. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm here, Delilah," he said. "I'm here for you. Always." They sent for the doctor, and Maria, who had become a close friend and confidant, arrived to assist with the delivery. The labor was long and arduous, testing Delilah's strength and endurance, pushing her to the limits of her physical and emotional capacity. Bo stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, wiping the sweat from her brow, his presence a constant source of comfort and support. He watched in awe and wonder as his wife, the woman he loved, the woman who had endured so much, brought their child into the world. As the first rays of dawn illuminated the sky, a new life entered the world. A baby boy, healthy and strong, his cries filling the room with a sound that was both a celebration and a promise. Delilah held her son in her arms, her heart overflowing with a love so profound, so intense, it brought tears to her eyes. She looked at Beau, his face streaked with tears, his expression a mixture of joy and relief. "He's beautiful, Beau," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Beau leaned down and kissed her forehead, his lips lingering on her skin. "He is," he said, his voice trembling. "He's perfect, just like his mother." They named him Ethan, as they had planned, a tribute to the past, a hope for the future. The name carried a weight of history, of tragedy, of forgiveness, of redemption. It was a name that represented both the pain of loss and the promise of new life. As they held their son, as they looked into his eyes, they knew that their journey had come full circle. They had faced the final confrontation, not of guns and violence, but of hearts and horizons, of past and future, of love and loss. They had emerged victorious, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, more resilient. The ranch, once a battleground of feuds and secrets, was now a sanctuary of peace and love, a place where a new generation would grow, where the echoes of the past would fade, replaced by the laughter of children, the warmth of family, the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The final confrontation had not been a clash of wills or a test of strength, but a merging of souls, a union of hearts, a testament to the enduring power of love, of forgiveness, of redemption. It was a confrontation that had transformed them, healed them, made them whole. They had the whole world in front of them, nothing but open horizons and blue skies. Epilogue. Years passed, and the Boone Landry Ranch flourished. Little Ethan grew into a strong, spirited boy, with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. He roamed the land, learning the ways of the ranch, absorbing the stories of the past, embracing the promise of the future. Delilah and Beau had more children, a daughter named Sarah, after the woman Beau had loved and lost, and another son, named Caleb, a controversial choice, but one that Delilah insisted upon, a symbol of forgiveness and redemption, a way to honor the man who had betrayed them, but who had also, in his own misguided way, loved them. The ranch became a gathering place for family and friends, a haven of warmth and laughter, a testament to the enduring power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. The scars of the past remained, visible and invisible, but they were no longer a source of pain or regret. They were reminders of the challenges they had overcome, the battles they had fought, the love that had sustained them. Delilah and Beau grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond strengthened by the shared experiences, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and setbacks. They watched their children grow, marry, and have children of their own, the ranch echoing with the sounds of a new generation, the cycle of life continuing unbroken. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a familiar scene that had played out countless times over the years, Delilah reached out and took Beau's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "We did it, Beau," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a quiet contentment. "We made it." Beau smiled, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes reflecting the love that had endured for decades, that had survived betrayal, loss, and the relentless passage of time. "We did," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We made it. Together." They sat there in silence, their hands clasped together, their bodies touching, their hearts beating in unison, their souls connected by a bond that could never be broken. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, a reminder of the past, but also a promise of a new dawn, a new day, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The debt and spurs had been paid, not in blood or violence, but in love, in forgiveness, in the unwavering commitment to a shared future. The echoes of the past still lingered, but they were faint, distant, overshadowed by the vibrant tapestry of the present, by the promise of a future filled with hope, with joy, with the enduring power of family. The land was theirs, but so was their love.